I don't expect anything to do with what we're doing this evening, but it may well be. Time will tell. Thank you. Okay.
Despite that, I'll try the microphone. Is that reasonable?
Yes.
Yeah. It's a bit awkward when you're trying to do. Sorry. Is it still breaking up a little bit? Yeah. Yeah. Try that.
No.
Yeah. The judging, it's where you stand as well, but I don't want to stand in the middle if I can help it. If I stand about here, that sounds about right. We should go back to the chapel. It's much more reliable, perhaps. Anyway, thank you for all coming this evening. Yes, I'm Alan Heasman. Now, a lot of you have lived in the village a long time, so I'm sure you know far more about the pubs than I do. I've only been here 14 years. But when you're suddenly asked to do a talk, you suddenly have to become a bit of an expert. So there's been a bit of a panic over the last few months, requiring several visits to the local pubs, of course. Necessary, but there we are, we have to do these things. So although it says a history of pubs, it's a short history, because clearly you could go on a long time about pubs and brewing in general, but I'm trying to go and focus mainly on Aldbourne this evening. So we're going to deal with the earliest days of ale brewing. We're going to have a little look at the development of brew houses and the arrival of beer being slightly different to ale. I'll come on to that in a moment. And the growth of taverns and inns generally in the country, and in particular those in Aldbourne. And brewing in Aldbourne, both in the past and of course the present. And when you were coming in, I hope you took time to look at the display at the back. There's a few items kindly donated and loaned to us from Ramsbury Brewery. And I mentioned Ramsbury, tongue-in-cheek, but it's actually, of course, still in the parish of Aldbourne, being at Stock Close Farm. So it just about counts as an Aldbourne brewing facility. And then there may be a little bit of testing at the end of the evening for those who'd like to partake. There's some bottles down there, not yet opened, and there's some glasses, and you might like to try that, or the tea and coffee will be available as usual. So ale. It was a staple drink for all classes of society in the very earliest days, Anglo-Saxon times. In fact, ale was even exported to the continent because it was thought to be so good. And it was safer to drink, of course, in many places than in the towns in particular. Probably around here with our water supply it would have been okay, but they preferred to drink the ale. It's fermented as a liquor from water and malt, and the malt was really any grain, but particularly barley, which grows quite well in southern England, wheat, oats or rye. So malt is a rather general term, and you could obviously get your start in your fermented liquor. Relatively simple to make, just need some liquor, some grain and some water, but it didn't keep very well, and it was difficult to transport, and thus it was mainly brewed and drunk as an at-home. I remember back in the 60s, 70s, home brewing became very popular for a while, probably because of Red Barrel being sold in the pubs, that anything was probably better than Red Barrel. It seems to have gone off now, you don't see quite as much publicity, but it very much was the thing to do in Anglo-Saxon and medieval times. Pretty foul tasting stuff, despite the addition of herbs. They tried to make it a little better, and as you can read there, once described as the wash in which piggies had wrestled. Not quite sure about piggies, but I think I know what they mean, but they obviously tasted pretty foul most of the time. And the wives, well, I can't blame them for the taste, but they were mainly the people who brewed, and thus the word alewife, which is still used occasionally even in this day and age, came to be related to the brewing industry. But of course they had surplus, more than they could probably drink themselves, and so it would be offered to sale to any passing strangers. And it was to show that this is where the origin of the signs outside of the pubs come from. You'd either stick a branch or a pole outside your cottage to say you had surplus ale to sell. And there's one or two pictures coming from that period. Obviously early medieval text here, showing this brush or broom sticking out of the cottage, and the chap being offered, he's holding up a bowl to his mouth, so he's obviously taking a sup of ale, and the lady's there has got a generous flagon, a little bit bigger than the one I'm using this evening. And similarly, another medieval text which shows slightly more sophisticated sign to show that ale was available. This is a cross sign, so the beginning of the sort of typical pub signs that we're used to today. But it was very much an intermittent trade most of the time. You just obviously sold if you had something surplus. Anyway, these later developed into the more complex signs with the emphasis on pictures to help overcome the general illiteracy. A good example, of course, is the blue boar, particularly powerful symbol. A beautiful painting which we've had outside the pub there for several years now. And of course, by the time the signs became symbolic, then the old sign would just have been a blue boar image, nothing quite sophisticated as we have there, probably quite crudely painted. But the symbol of the blue boar is a heraldic device, particularly of the Earls of Oxford, and one of those was on the winning Lancastrian side in the Wars of the Roses, the Battle of Bosworth. And so perhaps the sign and the name of our oldest pub indicates some sort of allegiance to the Earl of Oxford, or just simply acknowledge the victory, because after the Second World War, for example, you'd have things named after famous battles and Churchill and other well-known leaders, so it seems very much typical that they may have done the same thing for the Wars of the Roses. You've got to note, I'll come back to this in a moment, that the blue boar is seen trampling over another ensign of the white boar and the white rose, which represented the House of York. So it very much emphasises, at least on the modern sign that we've got, that it was a result of the battle. So you can have another look, you can just about see at the bottom there the white ensign, and if you look very closely, there is a white boar on the ensign. So that's a little bit about how the signs develop. But as usual, with all things that you enjoy, regulation soon set in. King Ethelred, pre the Norman invasion, he set up fines for breaching the peace as a result, presumably, of drinking the ale. And if somebody was killed, you were fined 6 half marks. Not sure why it isn't called 3 marks, but anyway, it was down to 6 half marks. Only about £1 even at today's values. If nobody was killed, you were fined a little bit less. So there was some consolation, in fact. So apart from possibly a sign, there was nothing very distinctive about these early ale houses. There's no real evidence. Lots of pubs in the country will claim incredible lineage to dates long gone, but in fact the buildings were nothing particularly special, so many of the cottages may have been pubs in the past and just disappeared. Very early to prove, very difficult to prove. But the Blue Boar is a very good example of a simple cottage style of pub, of which there are very few left in this country. Apart from the more recent addition of the restaurant part alongside, it is just a very simple cottage. As you know, it's got a very small bar, probably always has had, and there are very few that are really in that style now. No specific mention of ale houses in the Domesday survey, which is surprising. They seem to value absolutely everything, your ploughing and crops and all sorts of things, but it does mention a few brewers. But a bit later on, Winchester, just down the road, recorded having a dozen breweries, but there was no specific mention of ale houses for drinking. And interestingly, our near neighbours up in Highworth, 1270s, there were only 60 people living there, but 30 of them were brewing ale. So, well, they had a very jolly time, or they were particularly industrious. But that probably reflects the fact that many villages will have lots of people brewing. And the authorities soon stepped in, and they always in for an advantage of tax. 1267, Henry III introduced this as the size of ale, so he started to standardise the quality and the quantity of used to sell it. In effect, a sort of first licence. A lot more legislation followed. I won't go into all the details, but it seemed every time a king came along he saw another opportunity to raise taxes. It does sound familiar, even today. Now it may not be the sovereign, but it's more likely to be the government. But that certainly was the case then, so that I won't go into details about that. It's not a lesson on the history entirely here. But it was mainly, sadly, aimed at the ale houses. The taverns and the inns, and the people who were a little bit well off seemed to escape some of the more draconian measures that were introduced. 14th century, hops were being added to malt. This had been going on the continent, particularly in Germany, for many years. But it obviously spread across, and it became the in thing, a new taste, I suppose. And southeast England, ideal for growing hops, down in Kent, it still is, and it was the first to benefit and grow hops. And then gradually it spread, and this made the ale much more palatable. It soon extended its shelf life, which made it useful. I use that modern terminology, but it made it a lot easier to keep and also to move around. So it's the beginning of transporting beer, and therefore probably in some way refining the fact that you could get a better beer from another village, so why drink your own rather dodgy brew? And so it probably began to impact on a lot of the home brewing. If we jump on to the 1830s, the Beer Act became quite famous. It gave greater freedom, and there was a tremendous explosion of general drinking places. A licence cost a sum of 2 guineas. And within 12 months, there were 24,000 new licences issued throughout the country. Mainly in the cities, of course, the towns, because the Industrial Revolution was gaining momentum, and obviously the workers wanted to drown their sorrows, so there was plenty of customers, so plenty of new licences were issued. And the beer house then opened for 24 hours, except during Sunday church services. But they were quite limited. They could only serve beer and cider, the majority of them. Wine and spirits required a separate licence, and that was probably saved for the inns and the taverns. Of course, excessive drinking led to the rise of the temperance movement, and you can begin to think why when we think that it was estimated in the 1860s that the public was spending 87 million then in their money at that time. But the government was only working with 750,000 for schools. So obviously there was a tremendous imbalance in the public, and there was a great outcry, and as you may know, there were a lot of temperance inns and pubs that developed, particularly in northern England, selling non-alcoholic beverages. And a general movement perhaps against excessive drinking in the gin houses. And so even more legislation and taxation was to follow. I strongly recommend, you probably won't see it in this light, but there was a book at the back. This book here, published by English Heritage, called Licence to Sell. It's a beautifully illustrated book and packed full of information about the general history of drinking in this country. So I recommend that if you are ever in an English Heritage source. Right, so what about Aldbourne? Well, the Blue Boar is the obvious place to start because it's generally credited as being one of the oldest of the pubs. Certainly it seemed to be here around about the 13th and the 15th century, probably as a cottage serving the itinerant masons. When the church was being extended and rebuilt post the Norman invasion, almost certainly the masons came from other areas to build it and then moved on. So they needed a lodging house and perhaps somewhere to drown their sorrows. Where better than a cottage just across from the church. And in 1516, generally known now that ale was served from an upturned bell before it was hung in the church. So that sort of definitely pins the date down, and almost certainly, as I say, it was earlier than the 16th century. Probably remained in continued use since then. There's a known closure, quite a recent one, 1911 to 1931. I don't know the reason, maybe somebody here in the audience knows, but I've not been able to establish why it closed and became a private residence during that period. That's known in particular. And I suspect it may well have closed at certain other times, maybe during the Civil War, times like that, but there's nothing recorded particularly. but we have evidence of it 15, 16, and it's obviously going strong now, so it certainly tends to favour being open most of the time. Apart from the signage and the restaurant addition, it's still got the cottage appearance I mentioned earlier on. And despite its longevity, it's been around a long time, it doesn't actually seem to feature very much in the events in the village. I guess partly because it's quite small, and I'll come on again to some other reasons later on for larger gatherings. But it certainly in recent times acclaimed some fame, particularly when the officers of the 101st Airborne who were billeted just next door to the pub in Hightown used it. And so we still get a lot of the visitors, the Americans, coming back to see us now who want to go and see the Blue Boar because it's been well written about in any of the records and memoirs of the 101st Airborne Division. But we mustn't forget its alter ego. You may or may not, particularly good shot, this one, of the cloven hoof. This was the, I'm sorry, I lost this, that's it. The cloven hoof, this was the pub that was set up as part of the Doctor Who film in the 1970s, Devil's End. It was filmed in Aldbourne, where they used the church and 4 barrows and the pub. And so the cloven hoof was its name just for the purposes of that. And here's a shot of the external, early 1970s of the Blue Boar, probably stripped of some of its pretty bits because obviously the filming company just wanted it to look as simple as possible. And I think down in the bottom right-hand corner of this shot is clearly one of the actors, or maybe an actress, running from the pub at that time where they were being filmed. I suspect people here obviously were around at that time and remembered the events. Which is quite interesting. And of course we still get Doctor Who fanatics visiting the village, perhaps in not so large numbers as the 101st Airborne followers, but we still do get them popping into the Heritage Centre in particular. Most of the time though, of course, it was the local, not necessarily attracting a huge crowd, but there's a shot, probably an Edwardian period shot, judging by the dresses. Looks quite a festive occasion, quite a few bits of bunting, banners. It could well have been the coronation period for George V, something like that. Maybe Edward VII, but or it would have been just a general celebration. A bit later on, though, 1970s, I guess, by the fashion. And if you can see there, any of the details. Does anyone want to offer any names of people? Perhaps they may reckon. Oh, there's Penny. You were there, were you? That was you, was it?
No, Ray Gould.
Ray Gould?
Yeah.
Right, okay. But, sorry, is he the... No, right, okay. And you can see the bar layout is somewhat different in the 1970s for us youngsters to the village. We can see a general difference. The bar's been reduced in size now, a little smaller area, given the sitting space. But quite an evocative 1970s shot. But as I say, there's very few photographs of the pub. If there are any that any of you hold, took a picture there because it was a celebration or something, I think the Heritage Centre would welcome it because we've got very, very few of the Blue Boar. So, moving on slightly, that's existed for something like 600 years, but there was a little bit of competition elsewhere in the village. And we move on to the George. Stunned silence perhaps from people. But there was a beer house, the George, on the site of what is now 24B, the Green, which I think I saw Dave at the back, Dave and Debbie. There's a hand there. Oh, he's over there now. Hi, Dave. Yeah, Dave and Debbie Sims live now, what was the old post office a while ago. But that was the George, and the George Inn. If my machine will work, just to give you a visual there. That's the right-hand end of that row of cottages there. We know a reasonable amount of detail about that because the left-hand side of the building, I think I mentioned in my talk about the fustian manufacturing a few months ago, because there was a fustian store and a fustian manufacturing at that end of the building, and the George Inn was at the right end of the building. And through the kindness of Dave and Debbie, I've been loaned some documents from 1699 which they have, along with lots of others. In later years, they got a very good record of all the people who have owned or leased that property over 300 years. And that confirms that certainly in 1699 it was called the Sign of the George, and had previously been called Church House. So we assume that it probably became a beer house from an inn somewhere around about the early 1600s, possibly even earlier, but we're not sure. But it was definitely functioning in 1687, because I mentioned it in my previous talk about Fustian. Edward Witts had the Fustian store, and he definitely mentions it as being part of that building. And this is the one I've jumped ahead slightly. 1699 mentioned as the lease, where it's heretofore called the Church House and now known by the name or sign of the George Inn. And obviously it looks to be a large building. Probably it was larger than the Blue Boar. So a substantial place, and in the 18th century the court leet or manor court met there. That's roughly equivalent, shall we say, to the parish council, the people who managed the area. And so it was a notable establishment, big enough to hold, hold meetings. This is an old, rather interesting photograph showing the cattle on the green and children playing. Not sure of the date, probably early 20th century. It doesn't really actually add much to the history of that, but it's a nice old shot. And again, we've got very few photographs because obviously it hasn't been a pub in recent years, so perhaps no particular reason to take photographs. In 1787 it was still called the George Inn, but by the time the Enclosure Act took place, around about 1806, 1809, it appears to have closed because it's not reported as being an inn at that time. And there's certainly a document, another one from Dave and Debbie's collection, that it was by then referred to as a private dwelling and no longer referred to as the George. As I say, it's very little other evidence of what went on there, but it was an active perhaps. And I say, well, perhaps it was upstaged. I use that word particularly because in the 1700s, Aldbourne was obviously thriving. The Fustian trade was going full blast. There were one or two other trades in the area. And so the Crown. And this seems to have been purpose-built because it's got all the signs and all the attributes in the right place. It's in the square, increased coaching passing through Aldbourne, lots of trade with good wagon and passengers backwards and forwards from London down to Swindon and the West Country. And of course highways were improving as well, so an ideal position for an inn where people could stay. They had outbuildings, stables, rooms for travellers, and the people to look after the horses, the ostlers. So it was definitely up and running by 1735, So it may have proved a bit of competition for the old George round the corner, and so loyalties may have shifted a bit. Lots of landlords, we know about the sequence of quite a few of them. One or two names people may recognise there, the Wentworths. Hodder, Thomas Hodder's name, either well known through Hodder Bridge, just down beyond down towards Preston. And of course, if you're into into bell ringing, the name Hodder is also synonymous with the history of the bell ringing in the village. And I was going to say some people might remember these, but I think that would be a bit unlikely. But you might recognise one or two. And notice Charles and William Gould, the name down there. I'll be mentioning that again later on. Substantial building, and it's housed many interesting events. I'm a subscriber to the British Newspaper Archive, which allows me to trawl through 20 million pages of newspapers, and if you stick the word Aldbourne in it, you get something like 13,000 mentions from the 1700s right through to the 1950s. A lot of them are advertisements, and of course we had racing stables in the village, so a lot of them end up being information about the horses, but there is a lot of interesting information there. So I've picked out one or two. The Enclosure Committee, which met in the village to arrange and rearrange the land dispersal in the early 19th century, they met there regularly. 1811, there was a meeting about the proposed turnpike, the improved road through from Hungerford and of course there's the Turnpike Cottage along the road, charging people to use the better quality roads. And then in the 1830s there was at least a couple of mentions of the Piccadilly shows, of which of course you're all familiar. Oh, well, there's a slight babble of interest there sometimes. For those of you who don't know, they're flower shows. Flowers with different coloured edges to their petals, derives from a French word. And there's an example of the sort of thing that you might see. And if you're in the village later on this year, through the auspices of Valerie Hood and is it the Gardening Club as such? Sorry, Valerie, wherever you are. You're over there. Where's Valerie? Oh, right at the back, sorry. We're going to have a class of Piccadilly class in the horticultural section in September, isn't it? I think, Valerie? Yeah. Sorry? Yeah, in September. So a chance to revive the 1830s in the village by having a special class for Piccadilly flowers. As I say, it features in many newspapers. It was the place to hold all the property auctions for well over 100 years. One of the very earliest ones, 1799, when they sold some property in Castle Street and West Street that was owned by Thomas Gould. Again, the Gould name popping up. And as late as 1920, the sale of Alma Cottage, that all took place as an auction in the Crown. And there are dozens and dozens in between. Lots of social events, because it was fairly substantial property. 1839, you could have taken yourself along, if you were one of the most respectable families, you could along to the annual ball. There was dancing from 8 till 1 a.m, so that'd be pushing the limits even today. And then they sat down for supper, 1 o'clock in the morning. So Alan, you've got something to rise to here. You've got a little challenge. Yeah. And then the dancing recommenced with great spirit until an early hour. So they really knew how to enjoy themselves in the 1830s, if you were from a respectable family. Other examples, they had a ploughing match supper. A tithe audit supper, that sounds a ball of fun. And the visit by the Wiltshire Archaeological Society to see the little museum. I think it was probably only there temporarily, but it was set up probably as a result of the archaeological interest in the Four Barrows and the North Farm area in the late 19th century. So it was the place to come and view some of the exhibits. And one of the times they held a bell ringers supper. I think Terry used to hold a bell ringers supper.
Yeah, we have a Christmas do.
A Christmas do, so it's a very, very similar, I should imagine. And 1896, the pig club supper. I think we lack a pig club these days, unfortunately. Maybe Alan Duck at the back there could revive that with his interest in the ducks. The Crown regular venue for slightly more sad occasions, the coroner's inquest, when they used to come to the place where people had died, perhaps unexpectedly. Particularly interesting one, 1840, Robert Drew, 50-year-old out pensioner of the Chelsea Hospital. Let you read that for some time in a delicate state of health, but wanted to go off to Hungerford to collect his pay, his pension, and he procured a donkey cart. Unfortunately, on the way home he felt much worse and died in Chiltern Folio. So that's the sort of incident. And of course the coroner had to come to a verdict. This style of verdict was used extensively in those days. If there was no other explanation, blame God. Yeah, and you'll find that on quite a few of the coroner's reports. And similarly, sad newspaper reports. There was an inquest 1843. A little toddler who wandered out of his cottage and drowned in the brook. Still a potentially dangerous part of the village, so perhaps we're rather fortunate that not too many cottages as such, with youngsters right next to it these days. Right, the Crown, well, we recognise that painting around about the 1806, 1810 when that was painted, and you can probably just about make out there's a stagecoach outside the front door of the pub, and people are, and the cattle that used to wander around. But essentially, what the great thing, as we know about Aldbourne, hardly any significant changes in the layout.